June 1986. A farmer working a cornfield in Enos, Indiana, roughly 70 miles outside Chicago, notices the soil sitting wrong in one section of ground. Loose, disturbed, sunk in a way freshly planted earth doesn't sink. He calls it in, and what investigators pull out of that field, buried side by side, are two brothers, Tony Spilotro and his younger brother Michael, beaten so badly that identified them took dental records, not faces. Here's the detail that should stop you before we go any further. Tony Spilotro was, by that point, one of the most feared men in the history of American organized crime, a man the Chicago outfit had trusted for 2 decades to run their entire Las Vegas operation. And when his own people finally decided he had to go, they didn't shoot him in a car or drop him off a bridge. They beat him and his brother to death by hand and buried him in a field like something you want to forget you'd ever grown. Now, picture Joe Pesci in Casino. Nicky Santoro, quick-tempered, quotable, dangerous in the way movie villains are dangerous, which is to say entertaining. You root against him, and you still kind of enjoy watching him work. That's a compliment to Pesci's performance, and it's a complete distortion of the actual man. The real Tony Spilotro didn't lose his temper for the camera. He put a man's head in a bench vise as a debt collection technique, tightened it until a man's eye left its socket, and did it as a business method, not a breakdown. He built and ran a professional burglary operation that hit dozens of homes and businesses across the Las Vegas Valley, while simultaneously serving as the Chicago outfit's man on the ground, overseeing one of the largest skimming operations in casino history. 2 full-scale criminal enterprises, running at the same time for the better part of a decade, managed by one man who almost never lost control of either. This is the real story. The Chicago childhood that built him. The murders that made his name inside the outfit before he ever saw Nevada. The hole-in-the-wall gang, and why running alongside his real job made no sense on paper and made total sense to Tony Spilotro. What actually happened with Lefty Rosenthal? The man Casino turns into his best friend and rival at the same time. And exactly why, after 10 years of making Chicago enormous amounts of money, the outfit decided Tony Spilotro was worth more dead than alive. The kid from Grand Avenue. Every account of Tony Spilotro that matters starts in the same place, a working-class stretch of Chicago's near West Side, where his father ran a restaurant called Patsy's that fed cab drivers, cops, and increasingly as the years went on, men connected to Chicago outfit. Anthony Spilotro was born there in 1938, one of several sons, and grew up watching organized crime figures eat at his family's tables the way other kids grew up watching their fathers' co-workers stop by the house. Proximity like that does something to a kid. It normalizes a world most people only see from a distance, and it puts a face and a name on power long, before you understand what that power actually costs. Spilotro was small, well under 6 feet, and that detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because in a world built around physical intimidation, being small forces you to compensate in other ways. Some men compensate with charm. Spilotro compensated with a reputation for violence so complete and so consistently applied that his size stopped being relevant to anyone who'd heard what he was capable of. By his teenage years, he was already drifting into low-level criminal work around the neighborhood, and by his 20s, he'd attached himself to a man who would end up shaping the entire early arc of his career, a loan shark and outfit enforcer named Sam DiStefano, known on the street as one of the most sadistic men Chicago's underworld ever produced. Working under DiStefano wasn't an apprenticeship in the conventional sense. It was closer to a training ground in cruelty, and Spilotro absorbed the lessons completely. Debt collection under DiStefano wasn't a phone call and a deadline. It was theater built around pain, designed specifically to make sure word got around. Because in that business, reputation collects debts faster than any single beating does. Spilotro learned that lesson early and never forgot it. For the rest of his career, violence wasn't something that happened when Tony Spilotro lost control. It was something he deployed carefully as a tool, precisely because controlled cruelty is more useful to a criminal organization than random cruelty ever could be. The murders that built his name. By the early 1960s, Spilotro had built enough of a reputation inside Chicago's underworld that his name started attaching itself to some of the most notorious violence the outfit produced during that era, and one case in particular followed him for the rest of his life. In 1962, two men named Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia were suspected of killing a made associate of the Chicago outfit during a robbery gone wrong, and the retaliation that followed became one of the defining acts of brutality in the organization's history. According to accounts that surfaced later through law enforcement investigations and testimony from people connected to the case, McCarthy was tortured before he was killed, and the detail that stuck, the one that followed Spilotro's name for the rest of his life, whether or not every element of it can be independently verified in a courtroom, was that his head was placed in a bench vise and the vise was tightened slowly as a method of extracting information until the pressure caused catastrophic injury before he was finally killed. Whether every gruesome detail of that account is precisely accurate is something historians and investigators have debated for decades, since so much of what circulated came through second-hand accounts and street reputation, rather than courtroom testimony. What's not in serious dispute is that Spilotro's name became permanently associated with that level of calculated brutality, and that the association did exactly what reputations like that are meant to do inside organized crime. It made people afraid of him before he ever said a word to them directly. A year later, in 1963, a Chicago associate named Leo Foreman was murdered under circumstances that again connected back to Spilotro and the crew around DeStefano, reportedly after Foreman had become a liability and a talker, the kind of man whose mouth made him more dangerous alive than the money he generated. These weren't isolated incidents chalked up to youthful excess. They were the foundation of a reputation that told the entire Chicago outfit exactly what kind of asset Tony Spilotro was. Not just willing to kill. Plenty of men in that world were willing to kill. Willing to do it in a way that sent a message so effective it did some of his future work for him before he'd even walked in the room. By the time federal investigators and Chicago crime historians started compiling the full scope of Spilotro's suspected involvement in outfit violence over the following 2 decades, the number connected to his name, directly or through his crews, ran into the double digits, with some estimates placing it considerably higher. Exact numbers are genuinely difficult to pin down given how much of organized crime's internal violence never produces conviction, but the scale itself tells you something important. This wasn't a man who killed occasionally, under pressure, when things went wrong. This was a man for whom killing was a recurring, almost routine part of doing business. Sent to run the desert. By the early 1970s, the Chicago outfit had a problem that required exactly the kind of man Spilotro had proven himself to be. Las Vegas casinos, several of them under outfit-connected ownership or influence, were generating enormous skim profits, cash pulled quietly from the count rooms before it ever touched an official ledger and routed back to organized crime families across the Midwest. Running an operation that valuable at a distance of nearly 2,000 miles required someone on the ground who could protect the money, discipline anyone who threatened it, and represent Chicago's interests with total authority. Not a figurehead, an enforcer with real teeth, trusted enough to be given that kind of reach without constant oversight from home. Spilotro was sent to Las Vegas in 1971, officially just another resident, unofficially the outfit's man overseeing its entire Nevada interests. He set up a jewelry store called the Gold Rush on the Strip as a legitimate front, a business that gave him a public reason to be constantly moving through Las Vegas's commercial world, while actually functioning as a base of operations for everything from fencing stolen goods to holding meetings that had nothing to do with jewelry. And this is where the sophistication of the man really starts to separate from the movie version, because Spilotro didn't simply protect Chicago's casino interests and stop there. He built out an entirely separate criminal enterprise on top of it, one with no direct connection to his actual job, purely because the opportunity existed and he had the organizational skill to run it without letting it interfere with his primary responsibility, the gang that went through walls. The operation that became known as a Hole in the Wall Gang wasn't a nickname investigators invented for dramatic effect. It described their literal method. Rather than breaking in through doors or windows, which trip alarms and attract attention, Spilotro's crew would identify a target, often a home or business believed to hold significant cash, jewelry, or valuables, and physically cut or drill through an exterior wall, usually from an adjoining space or undercover night, bypassing the entry points that alarm systems were actually built to protect. This wasn't a crew of opportunists smashing windows. It required planning, patience, and a level of operational discipline that mirrors legitimate skilled labor more then it mirrors the popular image of burglary ring. Targets were studied. Entry points were selected based on structural weaknesses and blind spots in surveillance coverage. Crew members needed real technical competence, not just nerve. And running an enterprise like that successfully across dozens of jobs over several years, without it collapsing into the kind of chaos that draws immediate law enforcement attention, required exactly the same organizational mind that made Spilotro valuable to Chicago in the first place. Think about what it actually meant for one man to run both operations simultaneously for most of a decade, during the day or whatever hours a man like that considered normal. Spilotro was managing Chicago's most sensitive financial interests in Nevada, a job that required discretion, low visibility, and constant awareness of federal surveillance. At the same time, he was directing a burglary ring that, by its very nature, generated police reports, insurance claims, and exactly the kind of attention his primary job depended on avoiding. These weren't complementary operations. They pulled in opposite directions, and running both without either one collapsing the other for years to the level of compartmentalized discipline that the loose cannon version of Tony Spilotro simply isn't capable of. The movie needs Nicky Santoro to feel like he's constantly one bad decision from disaster, because that's dramatically satisfying. The real Spilotro ran two demanding criminal enterprises in parallel for the better part of a decade specifically because he wasn't that man. Eventually, in 1981, the FBI cracked a hole in the Wall Gang's operation after tracing a burglary back to crew, an investigation that produced arrests and put federal attention on Spilotro in a much more direct and public way than anything connected to his casino work ever had. It's worth sitting with the irony here. The freelance side project, the one that had nothing to do with his actual assignment from Chicago, is what finally started pulling serious federal heat onto him in Nevada, not the skim. The burglary ring he ran purely because he could. Rosenthal, not a friendship the way the movie sells it. Casino builds an emotional core around the relationship between Sam Rothstein and Nicky Santoro, childhood friends from the same Chicago streets who end up on the same team in Las Vegas, but drift toward mutual destruction as the pressure mounts. It's a compelling structure for a film, and it's a significant simplification of what actually existed between the real men behind those characters, Frank Lefty Rosenthal and Tony Spilotro. Rosenthal and Spilotro didn't know each other from Chicago, and there was a genuine working relationship between them once both men ended up in Las Vegas, Rosenthal running the day-to-day operations of the Stardust and several other outfit-connected properties with real skill as a sports bettor and casino operator. Spilotro overseeing Chicago's broader interests in the city, including, by extension, keeping an eye on Rosenthal's operation. But describing this as a close personal friendship overstates what most accounts actually support. It was closer to a working alliance between two men who served the same organization, respected each other's competence in their respective domains, and understood they needed each other functional and out of serious trouble in order for Chicago's Nevada interests to keep running smoothly. The tension the movie builds toward wasn't really about a slow-burning betrayal between best friends. It was about two men with fundamentally different professional instincts, forced into overlapping territory, whose respective visibility problems eventually started threatening each other. Rosenthal drew public attention through his own combativeness with Nevada gaming regulators, fighting his gaming license denial publicly and loudly in a way that put a spotlight on exactly the kind of outfit connections everyone involved needed to stay quiet. Spilotro drew attention through his own reputation, and eventually the whole in the Wall Gang investigation. Each man's problems made the other man's job harder, and Chicago, watching both of their visibility increase at the same time, had every reason to worry that either one of them could bring the entire Nevada operation down. The personal element the movie leans on hardest, an affair between Spilotro and Rosenthal's wife Jerry, does have real grounding in accounts from people connected to the case, and it's generally treated as accurate by researchers who studied this period closely. But even that detail matters less for what it says about a romantic betrayal, and more for what it says about the broader unraveling happening around both men by the early 1980s. Personal relationships fraying at exactly the moment federal pressure was mounting from multiple directions on multiple fronts. It's not a tragic love triangle so much as a slow-motion collapse of an entire arrangement that had worked well for Chicago for the better part of a decade and had finally started generating more risk than reward. The Black Book and the weight of being watched. By the early 1980s, Tony Spilotro's name had become one of the most recognized in American law enforcement circles connected to organized crime, and that recognition came with real, tangible consequences for Chicago's operation in Nevada. Nevada gaming regulators placed Spilotro in the state's official list of excluded persons, commonly known as the Black Book, a formal designation barring him from setting foot in any licensed casino in the state. For a man whose entire value to Chicago depended on his ability to move through the casino world with authority and discretion, being legally barred from every casino floor in Nevada gutted his practical usefulness almost completely. He could no longer walk a casino floor to check on operations, couldn't meet contacts inside the properties he was supposed to be overseeing, couldn't do the actual job Chicago had sent him to Nevada to do, without doing through intermediaries and workarounds that multiplied his exposure and everyone else's every time he tried. At the same time, federal investigators were closing in from several directions simultaneously. The broader Strawman investigation, the same sweeping case that eventually took down Kansas City's Nick Savella and connected operations across multiple Midwest families, was mapping the entire skim network Spilotro had spent a decade helping protect. The hole-in-the-wall gang prosecution had already put his name and face into criminal proceedings in a way that made him radioactive. Every additional headline, every additional court appearance, every additional piece of public attention made Tony Spilotro a bigger liability to an organization whose entire operating model depended on staying invisible. This is the part the movie's loose cannon framing genuinely gets right, even if it exaggerates how Spilotro personally handled it. He genuinely had become a magnet for exactly the kind of scrutiny organized crime cannot survive long-term. The difference is that the real man's problem wasn't a failure of self-control. It was closer to the natural, almost mathematical consequence of having run two demanding, high-visibility criminal enterprises in the same city for a decade. Eventually, the accumulated attention from both operations was always going to converge, and by 1985 and into 1986, it had. Why Chicago stopped protecting him? Understand what Tony Spilotro represented to the Chicago outfit senior leadership by this point, because it explains a decision that otherwise looks almost unthinkably brutal. For roughly a decade, Spilotro had generated enormous value. He'd protected Chicago's casino interests, kept discipline among the crews under his authority in Nevada, and represented the organization's power effectively enough that few people dared cross Chicago's interests directly while he was a man enforcing them. That track record bought him real loyalty and real patience from outfit leadership over the years, patience that let him get away, for a long time, with running an unauthorized burglary operation on the side and conducting an affair with Rosenthal's wife, both of which created exactly the kind of unnecessary risk a more cautious organization would never have tolerated from a lesser earner. But by the mid-1980s, the calculation had fundamentally shifted. The Strawman prosecutions were producing convictions across multiple families. The hole-in-the-wall case had already exposed federal investigators to detailed knowledge of Spilotro's operational methods. His Black Book status had crippled his usefulness in the one city he'd been sent to control. And every additional day he remained free and active represented additional risk that he might eventually be squeezed by prosecutors the way cooperating witnesses so often were squeezed in cases exactly like this one, a pattern Chicago's leadership had watched play out disastrously for other organized crime families throughout that same period. For an organization built on protecting itself above any individual loyalty, no matter how earned, Tony Spilotro had crossed the threshold from asset to liability. Chicago's leadership reportedly concluded that the man who had spent a decade protecting their interests in Las Vegas had become the single greatest threat to those same interests simply by continuing to exist as a free, increasingly exposed, increasingly cornered man who knew more about the operation's inner workings than almost anyone alive. The cornfield. In June 1986, Tony Spilotro and his brother Michael were reported missing after traveling to Chicago together, and what's generally understood from accounts pieced together by investigators afterward is that they were lured to a house in the suburb of Bensenville under belief they were attending some kind of meeting or induction related to organized crime business, a familiar setup that had ended other men's lives throughout the history of this world. Instead, both brothers were beaten to death, reportedly by a group of men connected to the outfit, in what investigators later described as an execution carried out with hands and fists rather than firearms, a method that in this specific context carries its own message. A gun is fast and impersonal. A beating of that severity requires sustained, direct participation from multiple people and inside organized crime. That kind of execution is sometimes chosen specifically because it eliminates any ambiguity about intent or commitment among everyone involved in carrying it out. Nobody in that room could claim distance from what happened. Everyone present had a hand in it. Their bodies were driven roughly 70 miles from Chicago and buried together in that Indiana cornfield, where they remained undiscovered for weeks until a farmer noticed the disturbed ground. The condition of the remains when they were finally recovered made formal identification through dental records necessary, a detail that tells you plainly how severe the beating actually was. No one has ever been definitively convicted specifically for ordering or carrying out the murders of Tony and Michael Spilotro, though the case has long been connected in law enforcement accounts and later organized crime prosecutions to senior Chicago outfit leadership of that era. Men who investigators believe made the decision that Spilotro's continued freedom had become too dangerous to tolerate. The full truth of exactly who was in that room in Bensonville and who gave the final order remains something historians and investigators have pieced together largely through second-hand accounts, informant testimony gathered years later, and the broader pattern of how Chicago handled liabilities during that specific period, rather than through a clean courtroom conviction naming every man responsible. What the movie couldn't hold. Step back and look at the actual shape of this man's life, because it tells you exactly why a 2.5-hour film had compressed him into something smaller than he really was. The real Tony Spilotro wasn't a hothead who eventually got what his temper earned him. He was a calculating operator who built his reputation through calculated violence rather than impulsive rage, ran two demanding, fundamentally incompatible criminal enterprises in the same city for the better part of a decade, without either one collapsing for years, managed a complicated professional and personal relationship with one of the most important men in Chicago's Nevada operation, and generated enormous value for his organization for so long that it took a mounting multi-front collapse of his usefulness before Chicago finally decided the risk had outgrown the reward. That's not a loose cannon. Loose cannons don't run parallel enterprises successfully for 10 years. That a disciplined, dangerous professional who eventually became too visible for the exact same qualities that had made him valuable in the first place, and whose death, when it finally came, wasn't a dramatic shootout or a single moment of betrayal caught on camera. It was a quiet, brutal, almost administrative decision, carried out by hand, in a house most people will never hear the name of, ending in a cornfield 70 miles from the city he'd made his name in. Joe Pesci gave us a man you could root for even while you feared him. The real Tony Spilotro never needed anyone's approval, charm, or forgiveness to be effective. He needed only to be trusted completely by an organization built entirely around loyalty, and then for a decade he was. Right up until the moment that same organization decided trusting him any further was a risk it could no longer afford to take. If this gave you a fuller picture of the man behind Nicky Santoro, subscribe, because Vegas has more names worth this same treatment. Next week, we're covering Lefty Rosenthal himself, the man Robert De Niro's character was built on, and how a car bomb rigged under his Cadillac in 1982 became the moment that told him exactly how far Chicago's patience actually extended. Drop a comment and tell me whose story you want next, because almost every name connected to this era turns out to be carrying more weight than the movie ever let on.